And speaking of the central problem of this government, never fulfilling the central promise of itself as an opposition. Never forget, this was the promise of the Prime Minister. There's no asterisks, there's no ifs, there's no buts. That everything is going up. This was in May, of course, of 2022. Well, right now, the promise was that a Labor government will lower the cost of living. But we all know that didn't happen last year. It isn't happening this year. Oh, well, the headline figures are slightly better than they were 2-3 months ago, and there's a good chance that the economy will get better in the next 6 months. But the reality is that everything is costing more than it did before you hired these people to run the country. Now, you see, despite the fact that you were living in the cost of living crisis, we were talking about it each and every night. This was just a nothing burger to be pushed to one side. Because remember, the total point of last year for the Prime Minister was to create a legacy that meant that even if he was a one-term Prime Minister, unlikely, that you would forever be able to say, Albo, he was the one who, oh, that's right, put the voice into the Constitution. Now, remember, it was his choice when the referendum took place, rather than doing it when the support was 60-40. He took all year talking about it, so people didn't believe that the cost of living, which was their priority, was his priority, and of course it ended up going 60-40 the other way. Because all year last year and into this year, regardless of what the media told you was the issue du jour, the issue that mattered was how expensive everything was in your world. In fact, a poll just last week, 74% of Australians believe that it is the number one issue. Even bigger than that, 81% of people say that Labor has not done enough. Now, the Prime Minister will say, well, we've done plenty on cost of living. There's $16 billion worth of changes. Well, firstly, those are not $16 billion in 1 year. They're counted out over multiple years. He talks about things like childcare. OK, that's great if you've got a kid that's not in primary school yet, but that's not the vast majority of Australians. We've made medicines cheaper. Well, that was going to be the policy of both parties going into the last election, and the reality is that while a lot of people will have their medicines, the reality that that is the financial difference that you need most in your life, of course, isn't true. The promise of $275 reduction in power bills by 2025, well, that went up in smoke within days of him becoming Prime Minister. And in fact, even today, when the inflation rate is going down, when you actually look at how much power prices went up in the past month, it's still well over 10%, let alone gas and other fuels. You see, that's the reality of the life you live. But the life that much of the media lives is to try to find a way to dig the Prime Minister out of his hole, to be able to make sure that Labor wins the Dunkley by-election, and then nothing to see here, Australians are still deeply in love with the greatest Prime Minister of all time. Which is why the Prime Minister had a relatively light schedule over summer. Now, some in his office, no doubt, would have had their fingers crossed that there were more natural disasters, but he went to those that were, of course, in Queensland. Not a lot of time for the situations of bushfires in Perth, because we were waiting for the big one that he really wanted, which was, of course, around Sydney or Victoria. I'm just saying politically, of course. But what the Prime Minister did do was a phalanx of interviews, press conferences and some things, while he basically would pop his head up and then go back to hosting barbecues at the Lodge or at Kirribilli House. In fact, according to the Australian newspaper, there was more than 50 appearances that he's made in the media, and he has been saying the one thing over and over again to really make you think that he cares about the problem that he didn't care about last year, that was even worse last year, but you're still facing the effects of this year, cost of living.
Cost of living. The cost of living. Cost of living. Cost of living.
So this bloke's all about action. It's all about changing the narrative. It's all about bringing the Australian people back into the conversation. So what is the Prime Minister's 2024 first cab off the rank big idea to deal with cost of living? Is it going to be doing something about power prices for normal Australians? No, sorry, we won't be doing that. Is it going to be making serious tax changes to things like petrol prices? No, there'll be none of that. Is there a plan to reverse the taxation which is being put on heavy vehicles, which means that everything that moves around the country is costing more to do so? Rightio. No, this bloke's doing something even bigger than that. To show how serious he is about cost of living, the Prime Minister is going to use taxpayer funds to fly every Labor MP back to Canberra for a chat about cost of living on Wednesday. Now, whether there'll be big announcements and big ideas, all of course to win the Dunkley by-election on March the 2nd, rather than to actually change your life, we'll all wait and see together. But how do you think the news covered this tonight? It is not the Prime Minister changing a single thing for a single person. It is the Prime Minister using even more taxpayers' money on top of the $40 million that politicians paid on themselves to keep themselves in office last year, on top of the millions of dollars of private flights that he has taken in Toto 1, or the old frequent free flyer Miles has done, in order to land closer to his home in Geelong. No, the solution is to call MPs back for a talk fest. The media think, well, breaking news.
Ahead of this week's cost of living crisis meeting, we're beginning to learn what the government is planning to do and when. But Labor is tonight balancing the expectation of relief with the reality of an economy under pressure.
OK, that's a bit 50-50, but what about the reporter? Is there any subtle things he may do in his package to show he agrees with the Prime Minister's move? Roll the tape.
The Prime Minister has said there's obviously more for us to do.
And after summoning Labor MPs to Canberra for a midweek meeting, there's an expectation the government will do more.
Literally, cheer the dear leader. Everything they do is amazing. Look, I've done my best to try to bite my tongue and not swear. They are taking the proverbial. They are playing the politics over and over again. Oh, I really care about this problem. I 100% care about this problem. And to show how much I care about this problem, I won't do anything about this problem. I'll just say this problem over and over again. So that people that are half paying attention will turn around and say, geez, I tell you what that Prime Minister's doing. He's talking about that problem a lot. And if he's talking about that problem, he must be doing something about it. What, the bills have gone up in the past month? Oh, bugger. That's the whole game. And the press gallery, rather than just turning around and saying, couldn't you do this on Zoom? OK, fine, he wants to have a meeting with his MPs. OK, the ones maybe in New South Wales and Victoria, they could drive there, it's not that far, there's plenty around the ACT. But the idea that Labor MPs are supposed to get on a plane from Western Australia to fly to Canberra to sit in the studio audience of a press conference tells you everything about the reality of how this bloke's not dealing with the problem. It's all sizzle, no steak all the time. And the problem is that rather than a media that would call a government out for talking about a problem that they are doing nothing seriously to deal with, means that they are trying to pull the wool over your eyes. Well, that's not the way we play it. It's the way we never play it. It's why we not just look at the man, but look at the ball and the play and the rules and how the game's being fiddled with. Each and every night. We'll do it for you, and we'll certainly be doing it for you this week. Oh, and by the way, while they're doing something about cost of living by spending your money to fly MPs to Canberra to be in the live studio audience for an Albo TV press conference, a pint of beer is now going to make its way towards $15. $15. Why? Because you see, there's this thing called a tax, and the tax which has been increased by this government means the cost to beer drinkers is going to increase. Is it enough to break the bank? No. Save the country or end cost of living crisis if they got rid of it? No. But it's a perfect example. They increased taxes on the heavy vehicle industry. Geez, I wonder why everything's so expensive when it gets to the supermarket. They don't cut excise on petrol. It hits record highs. And now if you want to have a pint or two or a slab, it's going to cost you more. Why? But we couldn't do anything about it. Oh yeah, and meantime, the International Monetary Fund has said that the government has to seriously take some actions or there'll be more interest rate rises. Now, I know that they told you that because 60,000 people lost their jobs, 106,000 people lost their full-time jobs in December, that interest rates were going to be going down. Well, guess what? If inflation doesn't seriously go down, and I don't just mean the headline number, I mean the huge drivers of it, the billion-dollar drivers of it, the steak, not the sizzle, then there is going to be even more pain for the same people who will not buy the BS in 2024, and rightly so.